August 27, 1979, Mullmore, Ireland. The morning is calm, the sea is flat. A 79-year-old man walks down to the harbour the same way he has done every summer for 3 decades. He boards his boat. He takes his grandchildren with him. They push out into the water, maybe a few hundred yards from shore, when the world ends. A radio-controlled bomb hidden beneath the deck detonates. Shadow V disintegrates in an instant. Lord Louis Mountbatten, cousin to the Queen, mentor to Prince Charles, supreme Allied commander, the man who dismantled an empire and helped build a king, is pulled from the water barely alive. He was gone before they reached shore. The IRA claimed responsibility without hesitation. They called it an execution. And in the years that followed, Britain mourned him as a hero, a statesman, a patriot, the grandfather Prince Charles never had. But there was another story, one that intelligence services had been tracking for decades, one that the royal family had worked quietly and deliberately to suppress, a story of private behaviour so at odds with the public image that American intelligence had opened a formal file on him. A story that asked a question the establishment refused to answer. What did they know? And when did they know it? To understand why the royal family found Mountbatten so useful and so dangerous, you have to understand what he was to them. He was not simply a relative, he was a project. A living argument that the monarchy could produce men of action, of consequence, of global significance. When the cameras found him, he was everything a royal ought to be. Tall, decorated, confident in a way that seemed effortless. He filled a room not with noise, but with certainty. The private reality was considerably more complicated. Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas of Battenberg was born on June 25, 1900, at Frogmore House, Windsor. His Serene Highness, not Royal Highness. That distinction mattered more than people understood. His family was royal, but only just. Close enough to the crown to carry its weight, too far from it to inherit its protection. His great-grandmother was Queen Victoria herself. His godfather was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. As a boy, he visited the imperial court at St. Petersburg, palaces covered in gold, balls that lasted until morning. He fell in love with one of the Tsar's daughters, Grand Duchess Maria. She was beautiful and untouchable and doomed. He kept her photograph by his bedside for the rest of his life, even after the Bolsheviks shot her entire family in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The family called him Dickie. It was a nickname that stuck for 79 years, and it carried with it a particular kind of intimacy. Dickie, close enough to be trusted, charming enough to disarm, ambitious enough to unsettle anyone paying close attention. His father had risen to First Sea Lord, the highest operational rank in the British Royal Navy, a German-born prince commanding the greatest fleet on earth. Then the First World War arrived, and everything German became suspect. Shops were burned, families were spat on in the streets, and however loyal Dickie's father had been, however many decades he had devoted to British naval service, it was not enough. The whispers grew too loud. He was forced to resign, pushed out in disgrace. The family changed their name. Battenberg became Mountbatten. Dickie was 17 years old when he watched his father's humiliation. He did not forget it. He made a vow that day to join the Navy, to rise higher than his father ever had, and to restore what had been taken. He spent the rest of his life doing exactly that, and in the process he accumulated power, influence and secrets in roughly equal measure. By the early 1920s, Mountbatten had his ambitions in order, but no money to support them. His naval salary was barely enough to maintain the appearance his position required. Then he met Edwina Ashley. She was the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Cassel, one of the wealthiest men in the British Empire. When Cassel died in 1921, He left behind a fortune worth over £7 million. Most of it went to Edwina. Overnight, she became one of the richest women in England, young, beautiful, and suddenly drowning in money. Mountbatten saw his opportunity. He was a prince with a title and no cash. She was a commoner with a fortune and no status. By all accounts, it was a practical arrangement. Edwina later admitted she was not entirely certain she was in love when she said yes. But Mountbatten was charming and handsome and offered something money genuinely could not buy: a direct line to the royal family. They married on July 18, 1922, at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, the wedding of the year. The Prince of Wales was best man. King George V and Queen Mary sat in the front pews. The guest list read like a registry of European aristocracy. For their honeymoon, they toured royal courts across the continent, visited Niagara Falls, and sailed to Hollywood, where Charlie Chaplin filmed them in a short home movie. Mountbatten, ever image-conscious, was delighted. Back in England, Edwina's money transformed everything: grand houses, endless parties, a lifestyle that would have been impossible on a naval salary. Mountbatten later confided to his daughter that in the early years he and Edwina sometimes struggled to spend their £60,000 of annual post-tax income. A struggle most people might have found manageable. But beneath the glamour, the cracks had already appeared. Edwina was restless, easily bored, hungry for something her husband's naval career could not provide. Mountbatten was consumed by ambition, by his climb, by his image. They were rarely in the same room, and so Edwina filled the space between them with other men. Her first affair was with Lord Molyneux, a former army officer described by those who knew him as the most handsome man in London society. That was followed almost immediately by Stephen Sanford, an American millionaire and champion polo player, then the handsome editor of a London newspaper. She did not bother ending one before beginning the next. Sometimes she managed 3 simultaneously. The staff at Brooke House, the Mountbatten London residents, developed their own quiet system for managing the chaos. On one particular afternoon, the housekeeper found herself confronting a situation no employment contract had prepared her for. 5 of Edwina's lovers waiting in 5 separate rooms: the drawing room, the library, the boudoir, the anteroom, and the hallway. She relayed the information to Edwina with the composure of a woman who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. When Mountbatten finally discovered the full extent of it, he was devastated. They discussed divorce. For a man who had built his entire identity around image and reputation, the scandal would have been ruinous. But he loved her money. She needed his connections. The divorce was set aside. Instead, they struck a deal: an open marriage, held together not by love, but by status and mutual convenience. And Mountbatten wasted no time finding his own arrangements. This is the part of the story that the royal family did not want examined too closely, because the question of exactly what Mountbatten did and with whom was not merely a matter of personal indiscretion. It was a question that American intelligence services had been formally tracking since 1944. The FBI file opened when Mountbatten became Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. The Americans were his allies, which meant they were also watching him. What they compiled over the following years was not flattering. The conclusion, set down in the official record and eventually released under a Freedom of Information request in 2019, described both Mountbatten and Edwina as persons of extremely low morals. The phrase was bureaucratic in its language and devastating in its implication. Mountbatten was aware that people talked. He once admitted, with the particular candour of a man who knew the details could never reach the newspapers, that he and Edwina had spent their married lives getting into other people's beds. He said it almost proudly. as if the honesty of the confession could serve as its own kind of defense. But the FBI file suggested the behavior extended well beyond the affairs that polite society had learned to absorb. The allegations that emerged in subsequent decades were of a different order entirely. A writer named Robin Bryans alleged in an Irish publication that Mountbatten had been part of a ring involving other establishment figures. The claims were explosive and contested, and the newspapers that might have pursued them in earlier decades had long operated under an unspoken agreement not to press too hard when royalty was involved. Then there was Kincora. The Kincora Boys' Home in Belfast was a residential care facility for vulnerable young boys. What took place inside it, over years and decades, became one of the darkest scandals in Irish institutional history. Staff members systematically abused residents. When the truth finally broke in the 1980s, investigators found evidence of a network of exploitation so extensive that it reached, according to some accounts, into the highest levels of British intelligence. The suggestion that it went further still, that some of the boys had been taken beyond the home's walls to other locations, to people of standing and power, was one that certain former residents were prepared to make under oath. Some of those former residents alleged they had been taken to Classybourne Castle, to Mountbatten's summer estate in Mullmore, to the house where, every August, the great man brought his family to fish and relax and wave politely at the locals who adored him. The allegations were examined by the Northern Ireland Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry. The inquiry's conclusion was that the original sources did not provide a basis for connecting Mountbatten to Kincora. His private secretary of 20 years denied the claims with complete conviction. He insisted that nothing of the kind could have been concealed from him. Mountbatten was never charged, never tried, never convicted. But the questions did not disappear. They accumulated in the same way that questions always accumulate around powerful men who have spent decades being protected by institutions with a vested interest in their reputation. Because that was what Mountbatten had: protection. The kind that came not from innocence, but from status. The kind that the establishment had been providing for him since the beginning. Consider what it took to maintain the image. Consider how much effort went into the management of a man whose private life was so consistently at odds with the public version. The FBI had been watching for 35 years. The files existed. The conclusions had been drawn. And yet the tributes poured in when he died. War hero, statesman, patriarch, grandfather. The eulogies were written before he was buried, and they bore no resemblance to the documents sitting in a federal archive in Washington. This is not accidental. This is how it works. The British establishment has always understood that the monarchy's value is inseparable from its image. A tarnished crown helps no one. And so, the people who might have spoken were managed. The documents that might have reached the public were delayed. The questions that might have been asked were redirected. And the man at the centre of it all continued to move through the world with the confidence of someone who had never genuinely feared consequence. Mountbatten had learned early that charm was its own kind of armour. He had learned it watching his father, who had all the loyalty and none of the protection. Dicky made sure he would not repeat that mistake. He built alliances everywhere, with Churchill, with Nehru, with Eisenhower, with Prince Charles, who needed a confidant and found one in his great-uncle, who wrote to him constantly, who visited Broadlands whenever he could escape palace life, who called him the grandfather he never had. The advice Mountbatten gave Charles about women was famously practical. "Sow your wild oats while you can," he told him. "Have your fun. But when it comes time to marry, find someone young, someone without a past, someone who brings no complications." This from a man whose own marriage had been a structured arrangement built on mutual infidelity, whose private life had attracted the attention of foreign intelligence agencies, whose name would one day appear in allegations about the abuse of children in institutional care. The irony was not subtle. It was simply never spoken aloud. By the late 1970s, Mountbatten was 79 years old and still the most prominent unelected figure in the orbit of the British monarchy. His influence over Prince Charles was total. His reputation, carefully constructed over 8 decades, remained largely intact. The sealed rooms of his private life had held more or less. The newspapers had honoured the old agreement. The intelligence files were classified, the allegations were contested. The story the public knew was the story Mountbatten had wanted them to know. And then the IRA decided they had heard enough of it. They had been watching him for years. The intelligence was not subtle. A car with Belfast plates sat near the harbour in Mullmore, day after day, its driver observing Shadow V. Through binoculars. The car had been used before to transport IRA weapons. British intelligence services identified it, tracked it for months, and did nothing. Maurice Oldfield, former director of MI6, had personally warned Mountbatten that members of the royal family were being actively targeted. The Irish police urged him not to return to Mullmore that summer. His own protection officer pleaded with him, "Stay away, just this once. Find somewhere else." An SAS-trained corporal who had been assigned to his security detail filed a formal report. Shadow 5 was a soft target. The boat sat in an unguarded harbour. Anyone could board it at night. Anyone could plant anything. Mountbatten waved it all away. He had been coming here for 30 years. The locals loved him. Who on earth would want to hurt an old man? He refused armed guards, said they made him uncomfortable, refused to allow police officers on his boat, said it spoiled the atmosphere. On the night of August 26, 1979, while he slept at Classybourne Castle, someone walked down to the harbour with 50 pounds of gelinite and a radio-controlled detonator, and all the time in the world. The next morning, Mountbatten took his family fishing. Some have speculated without definitive evidence that the IRA knew more than they acknowledged, that the choice of Mountbatten as a target was not merely symbolic, that the rumours which had circulated for years through certain communities in Northern Ireland had factored into the decision, that the execution, as they called it, was not simply about what he represented to the Crown, but about what some believed him to have done in private. There is no way to verify this. The IRA's stated reason was political. Mountbatten as a symbol of British imperialism, of colonial power, of everything they had been fighting for a decade to destroy. That alone was sufficient motivation. The other explanations remain in the territory of speculation. What is not speculative is the FBI file. What is not speculative is the open marriage, the affairs, the private behaviour that those close to him described with a frankness that surprised no one who had been paying attention. What is not speculative is that an inquiry was held, that allegations were examined, and that the full truth of what happened at Kincora and beyond has never been entirely established to the satisfaction of those who lived through it. What is not speculative is that Mountbatten spent the better part of his adult life being protected by a system that had a powerful interest in his reputation remaining intact. The tributes that followed his death were genuine in their way. Charles was devastated. The king wept. The country mourned. And in the weeks and months that followed, the image was reinforced rather than examined. War hero, statesman, visionary, the man who had overseen the end of empire with grace and purpose. The 1 million people killed in the chaos of partition were not mentioned prominently. The borders drawn by a lawyer who had never visited India, working from maps in a bungalow in Delhi, revealed 2 days after independence, when the violence was already unstoppable. That part of the story received somewhat less attention at the memorial services. The FBI file would not be released for another 40 years. The Kincora inquiry would not conclude until decades after his death. And the correspondence, the private letters, the documentation of a life lived at dramatic distance from its public presentation, was scattered across archives that were either classified, destroyed, or held by institutions with every reason to keep them sealed. This is the shape of the story the royal family did not want told. Not a single dramatic revelation, not one document that ends all argument, but an accumulation, a pattern, a gap between the man in the newspapers and the man in the files that grew wider with every decade and could not entirely be explained by the ordinary privacy that powerful people deserve. Mountbatten understood this. He had always understood it. The image was the power protected the image, and the cycle held as long as the right people remained in the right positions and the wrong questions were never asked loudly enough to require an answer. He was not the first member of the royal family's extended circle to rely on this arrangement. He would not be the last. But he may have been the one who tested it most thoroughly, who pushed it furthest, who accumulated the most that needed protecting and relied most heavily on the protection being there. When the bomb went off on the morning of August 27, 1979, it did not expose him, it ended him. And in ending him, it preserved the image more effectively than anything else could have. Because a man who dies a martyr's death does not face a reckoning. The questions that might have grown louder as he aged, as files were declassified, as former residents of care homes found their voices, as the distance from his living authority made it safer to speak, those questions arrived after the verdict was already written. The verdict was heroism, sacrifice, a great man taken too soon. The file in the FBI archive said something different. The families of the boys at Kincora said something different. The historians who have studied the partition of India said something different. And the people who lived 12 miles from that harbour in County Sligo, who had watched the intelligence services track a vehicle for months and do nothing, they had their own thoughts, which they kept mostly to themselves. What we are left with is a man who was genuinely brilliant in some respects and genuinely catastrophic in others, who served his country with real dedication and failed it with real consequences, who shaped the monarchy in ways that are still visible today and may have done things in private that no monument commemorates. The royal family understood, as they always have, that the story told about a person after their death becomes the story. The files can wait. The inquiries can conclude in careful language. The memorials can be grand, and the biographies can be authorized. And the full picture, the one assembled not from eulogies, but from declassified documents and closed inquiry reports and the testimonies of people who had no reason to lie, that picture can be kept just out of reach for as long as the institutions that built him remain committed to his reputation. Some of those institutions are still standing. The man who shaped kings and divided nations took his secrets to the grave. Whether those secrets stay there is a question that may not yet have an answer.